military intervention goes. There was one really couldn't see it, and up until 2014, of course, Putin and Russia explicitly recognized Ukrainian borders, and this was officially done in treaties, with the Treaty of Friendship signed shortly after the Soviet collapse, the 1994 Budapest Memorandum that was signed when Ukraine ceded its nuclear aspirations and transferred its nuclear materials to Russia. But again, complicated because Russia also didn't see Ukraine as having a right to complete independence. They vehemently opposed the idea of NATO membership for Ukraine. This wasn't always an acute issue between the two countries because even though many Ukrainian leaderships, including Leonid Kuchma, who came to power as a as a reputedly pro-Russian prime minister, actually pursued NATO membership and were orienting Ukraine in that direction. The majority of Ukrainians actually didn't support NATO membership, up until 2014. And Russia initially, up until 2013 or so, didn't really care much about the European Union, seeing that as a very distant prospect that wasn't very threatening. But overall, one of the telling results of public opinion, which I just bring up here based on some polling that I did with some colleagues, including in Russia with the Levada Center, which is an independent polling agency. In December 2021, we conducted a poll, and one of the questions was, what should Russia be doing in Ukraine? And how should Russia be addressing what's going on in Ukraine? And one of the responses was send troops there. And you could select multiple responses, but only 8% said that they would support Russian troops in Ukraine, fighting the Kiev government. And only another 9% even said that Russia should be sort of somehow otherwise actively supporting, doing non-military forms of support for the Russian propped up sort of pseudo states in the Donbass regions. And the vast majority of people didn't want any kind of involvement like that, instead limiting themselves to wanting humanitarian support. So I think my larger point here is that, it wasn't like there was a bubbling up of public opinion, which was calling for someone to reunite the supposedly separated brotherly peoples of Ukraine and Russia into a single polity. And again, I can talk a lot more about different dimensions of this. Instead, I think it has a lot more to do with Putin's own view of Ukraine. And he's reached a point as a leader where he'd consolidated power to such a degree where he had a great deal of autonomy to direct policy wherever he wanted, combined with the fact that he has established his regime in a way and manipulated information in a way that made him, I think, pretty confident that he could bring public opinion along with him. So I'm not saying that the majority of Russian people necessarily oppose what's going on now, but they weren't calling for it initially. And I think Putin has done more to kind of try to sell it to them in a certain way. And Putin's view of Ukraine, basically, and there's evidence for this going back a while, although I think it was underappreciated, how seriously he took this, and maybe his views have evolved over time as well, was essentially that, Ukraine was not really a state. He reportedly said as much at different occasions to different interlocutors, including President George W. Bush. His view was that, and is that many Ukrainians speak Russian and can be called Russian speakers and are therefore basically Russian, are part of what he and his allies have called a Russian world, Ruski Mir. That Ukraine as a state is divided, hopelessly divided and politically corrupt. And that, basically people around him I've noted that he's long held these kinds of views. And of course, he outlined these views in July of 2021 in his, I think what might only be really correctly called a screed about how Ukrainians are basically just historically misguided Russians, kind of duped by the West to think that there's something else and that really it's Russia's historical mission to bring them back into the fold. And there's evidence too. Ukraine, the FSB did polling in Ukraine and pulled out findings along these lines. Ukraine is corrupt. People don't like its government. Many of them are Russian speakers. Therefore, they are going to be likely to welcome us, with open arms if we just act. And so, you kind of mix that view with a super powerful leader, with a public opinion in Russia, which I think is actually very complex about Ukraine, right? So even though there's no bubbling up of desire to reunite the peoples, they could be sold this idea in a certain way. And again, I can talk about exactly how that was done later, also extremely interesting, but just for the sake of opening remarks, I want to get into what Putin got wrong and, what the reality was in Ukraine that he faced. And, partly what he got wrong, I think, was military, right? In that he underestimated how much more effective the Ukrainian military had become. I think a lot of us in the West did. I'm not a military expert, but I certainly wasn't seeing a whole lot of pieces out there saying Ukraine's army has become a very effective, super effective battlefield force. But in fact, they had instituted a lot of reforms after the initiation of the war in 2014, when Russia first seized Crimea and started operating militarily in Ukrainian territory. And this included things like decentralizing the command structure of the Ukrainian army so as to give commanders more operational control to adapt to situations on the ground. And so that's kind of a de-Sovietizing of the way things had been done in the Soviet military, and something that Russia hadn't done, which is one of the problems Russia faced, I think, where you see Putin really micromanaging the war effort. But that's kind of at one level. But I think more fundamental is just that Putin completely, in his account, completely misunderstands Ukrainians and their sense of national identity as something distinct from Russians. And that's something now I think everybody here has come to recognize quite clearly, given by how the Ukrainians have fought. But you look back in history, you find insurgencies, at least in Western Ukraine, against the USSR. One of the things that my co-author and I, Olga Onuch, in our book point out is that, in fact, there were a large number of dissidents that came out of the Eastern Ukraine in the USSR. So these were people who, supposedly were, part of the Russian-speaking area that Putin was counting on to be loyal to him. In fact, there was also a big tradition of dissidents and standing up to unjust authority that was evident there as well. They weren't always interested in independence related or nationalist issues. Sometimes it was other kinds of issues, but these were people who were bucking authority when authority was doing something unjust and taking very brave stands. Of course, if you go back to the referendum in 1991 on independence, you had majorities voting in every region, including Crimea, against the USSR and for Ukrainian independence. And I think much more, importantly, and kind of overall, just the use of Russian, even being what we would call a native Russian language speaker, and the enjoyment of Russian culture, and even kind of almost being embedded in Russian cultural space, right? Kind of being attuned to its stars and watching its programs and films, did not mean that people wanted to be ruled from Moscow in Kiev. So, very importantly, Ukrainian identity is not based on language, but instead on the experience of being Ukrainian. And of course, the Ukrainian language is bound up with that, but it doesn't mean that you have to actually speak that language to identify more as Ukrainian than Russian. And of course, that should be obvious to Americans, right? We speak English, right? And, you have what happened in the 1700s. Basically, this whole sense of attachment to Ukraine as a country, it developed over the years, especially, there's a long history there that we could talk about, but especially kind of was galvanized, my co-author and I write, after Ukrainian independence, because you had whole generations coming up that really had known only an independent Ukraine. I mean, they had some memory as children of the Soviet era, but even then things were starting to change. And that's Zelensky's generation. We call this the independence generation, right? You know, he is of that generation, and it reflects the group of people who are in power now, and they're sort of spearheading this resistance. That said, I mean, you still have the phenomenon of you know, pensioners, you know, clearly much older people also going out into the streets and you know, throwing themselves in front of tanks to try and prevent them from moving forward, prevent the Russian invasion from moving forward. And one other aspect that we highlight in the book is that this sense of identity in Ukraine is what political scientists often call, or sociologists too, civic identity, a civic national identity. So it's one not based on kind of ethnic criteria like who your parents were or you know, what language you speak, but it's about your identification with the country itself and with citizenship. And you know, this in particular is the aspect of Ukrainian identity that is strengthened over time, especially since Ukraine has been independent these last 3 decades. But part of this also is an attachment to ideas of democracy and freedom, which is something that contrasts Ukrainian sense of self from the sense of who Russians are and who Russians see themselves. And in saying that Ukrainians identify with democracy, I don't want to portray Ukrainian politics as some kind of democratic utopia. What people want and what they get are often two very different things. And there have been attempts by different Ukrainian leaders to really crack down on democracy, but there's a general support for a democracy that's been there and its different components. And so, you know, the way I characterize it in a lot of my works is I call it a patronal democracy, in the sense that, like, it, you know, patronal political system is one where people, for getting things done, can't really rely on an impartial rule of law, formal institutions, you know, systems of courts and judiciaries. And like, if you contribute, if you send off money to a charitable organization, you know, you have no guarantee that's not going to be misspent, right? But instead, the way people get things done is you go through people you know. It's where connections matter to a tremendous degree, and you have these extended networks of people that they mobilize among themselves, and these get turned into more or less hierarchical political coalitions that are basically extended networks led by powerful figures in Ukraine, such as oligarchs, you know, these big business people. And that's a lot of what political competition in Ukraine is. And so the point is that basically, I mean, one way I've summarized it is in Ukraine, it's a form of democracy, but it's more the competition involved is more a competition of political machines. It's kind of but you have multiple political machines. Like in Russia, you just have one, and it dominates everything. Whereas in Ukraine, you've traditionally had multiple political machines, and none of them can really completely control things. So they try to use corrupt methods to get an edge on the others, but none of them have ever been strong enough to get too far. And usually when they do start to look like they're getting too far, the others are able to mobilize public opinion and counteract those efforts. And that's a lot of what I think you see in the revolutions that Ukraine has experienced, you know, the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan Revolution. But despite the fact that the competition is effectively a competition of political machines, interestingly enough, the votes are pretty much you know, regularly counted honestly. And so they'll compete. They have to compete for the hearts and minds of citizens. But it is competition. It is openness. There's media freedom, in that you can have lots of different views expressed in Ukrainian politics, and ultimately the voters have been the ones to decide. And where the voters' rights have been constrained, you've seen these revolutionary efforts to overturn that. And then finally, just, you know, I'll say, I think we have, you know, the one thing that Putin greatly underestimated was the Zelensky factor. And Zelensky's rise within Ukraine, you know, it's interesting. I mean, he struck exactly these themes of civic Ukrainian national identity, de-emphasizing the need to rely on whether you use the Ukrainian language or what particular church you belong to, that what matters most is our common experiences as Ukrainian, in his words. And he just emphasized that, and he emphasized that all throughout his career, in public life in Ukraine, when he was a comedian and media producer and star and producer of a lot of popular shows. So these themes ran even through his entertainment content, but they were the backbone of his 2019 presidential campaign. And this was, exactly the theme that, he was able to hit in mobilizing, or tapping into the resistance of the Ukrainian public. So what Olga and I argue in our book is that the resistance, Zelensky's played an important role, but his role is not to mobilize the Ukrainian population so much, and it's not just his heroic resistance that's holding people back, but instead what he's doing is he's reflecting and amplifying this strong sense of civic national identity, and the hope for something better. And that's the other part of his appeal, has been a hope for overcoming this patronal aspect of their democracy and turning it into something real. And again, these have been very consistent themes throughout his political history that just happen to be the right notes for a leader to be able to strike credibly during the war. And I think this is all factored into his success. And so, this was what Putin missed. And it's the reason why, Putin didn't plan on this kind of resistance. He thought that basically people were going to welcome him with open arms, and that people like Zelensky, who himself is a native Russian speaker from these southeastern regions that Putin has claimed, would be welcoming him or just fleeing because they wouldn't care enough about the Ukrainian idea to face any threat to their lives for it. So Russia badly prepared in addition to all this. And then you have this Ukrainian mobilization, which has pushed Russia back considerably. Now we seem to be getting this long ground war that is playing out. And again, happy to talk about, my thoughts about that and where it's going. But maybe I'll just end the opening remarks there. There's so much to be said. And, but I look forward to hearing what you all have to say as well. And just having a good discussion. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Henry. It's an extraordinary privilege to have you here with us. And I personally have tons of questions, particularly about Zelensky and various mechanisms of power. And I see tons of questions are already coming into the chat. So I really look forward to a lively discussion. Traditionally, Steve and I start off with a question of our own. And I guess I want to say something to everybody listening first before we start off. I mean, I know Steve and I have made no secret of the fact that our sympathies in this struggle are totally on the side of Ukraine. And I'm sure that, most of you feel similarly. But I do want to also emphasize that it's also an important part of civic discussion, academic discussion, to pose questions and explore certain themes. And I think that it is perfectly legitimate to ask certain questions, say about Zelensky and his statecraft that might, sound that might say explore the hagiography around him. Rather than just reproducing it. And that doesn't mean that, say, if I pose such a question, I don't have great admiration for Zelensky. I think, so I just want to encourage us all to be open-minded in our discussion and to ask questions that whatever we might have. But I guess that will lead to then my question right now, which is that I have encountered myself, a number of people very strongly on the side of Ukraine who say that it is extremely important, as long as war is being waged, to sort of suspend any kind of criticism of the regime or draw attention to, say, I don't know, issues of corruption or relations with oligarchs or what have you, anything that could even slightly generate some kind of equivalence between, Ukraine and Russia, or sort of undermine this sort of moral good versus bad that is so, important in keeping public sentiment, strongly on the side of Zelensky, at least in Ukraine and Europe and the United States. So I guess I have a general and a specific question that are very related. Do you, Henry, think that this kind of unity during wartime is important? I mean, obviously, it's something that all regimes practice to a certain extent. I mean, in World War II, right, we focused on, I mean, it was pre-television, and we still like harnessed Hollywood to produce, 1942 classic films like Casablanca and Mrs. Miniver to, like convey emotionally the importance of supporting the war against Hitler. But it is ironic that Zelensky came up through the form of like political satire, right? His Servant of the People sitcom was, in essence, a way of sort of critiquing a certain kind of status quo, right? And now, he also emphasizes the need for unity. So I'd kind of like your thoughts on that. And then the specific question is that in almost exactly a year from now, March 31st, 2024, there's supposed to be presidential elections in Ukraine. Like, do you think those will happen? And do you think those will be like multi-candidate? And is that important to encourage, or is it, again, more important to emphasize that Zelensky does represent the will of the people?
Yeah, that's a great question, or set of questions. I mean, I think, I think partly, it's an interesting topic of study, right? Exactly how important and what form unity has to take. Because if people are hiding their real views too much, it might create a sense that among the people they're trying to convince of their unity, that in fact they are hiding their real views and therefore not being sincere, right? So there's a certain degree to which I think it's helpful for people still to keep it real, as it were. But at the same time, wartime is a time when people need to work together and work in harmony, and people are people. And so when people air criticism of one another, it can be taken wrong. One hopes that the spirit of unity will allow for the expression of differences. And on social media, for example, I mean, one will find people criticizing Zelensky in Ukraine. At the same time that they say they're not opposing him or calling for his downfall or anything like that. They're supporting him in the war effort, but they could be very critical. Some of our survey work in Ukraine finds that, not just ours, but, you have like 10-15% of Ukraine's population, including, and a lot of those are fierce supporters of the government's resistance against Zelensky, who oppose Zelensky. And then, we also use some experimental techniques to get a sense at kind of how, sincere the expressions of support are. And what we find is that his sincere, true, deep support in the population is along the lines of like 60%. But the other percentage, so roughly about a quarter of the population, are people who are, mostly fiercely anti-Russian, right? They're opposed to the invasion, but they think things like, well, Zelensky should have mobilized Ukraine sooner or in a stronger way, or something along those lines. And often these differences boil down to pre-existing partisan differences in Ukraine, right? Which are essentially partisan. I mean, I use that word very loosely because parties in Ukraine have something different, but have a kind of different meaning. But my point is that, as you said, there are a large, significant share. It's still a minority, but a significant share of people who are, fiercely on the side of Ukraine in the war, and maybe see Zelensky as not even being strong enough, or not necessarily hitting the right themes, that certain other things in addition need to be done, and are always worried about whether he is, maybe not going to prove himself to be the adequate leader that, they hope. And we write about this in the book, and talk about these political differences, and a lot of them go back to Zelensky's history as a satirist and a media figure. And we think that there are a lot of people there who still just don't fully trust him as a politician, and just don't fully trust that he's really capable of being up to the job as a leader. A lot of those people have been swayed since the war since the all-out invasion started, just by virtue of his performance, the fact that he stood so strong, has rallied Ukrainians to such a degree. But a lot of people do think, well, after the war, Ukraine is a democracy, and we'll have a big discussion about this. And so I think a lot of it has been pushed off to the side, and that leads Olga and me to think that Ukraine's a democracy, and this is not gonna be a case where everybody unites around Zelensky and then he becomes this dominant dictatorial figure into the future, because there will be political divisions that resurface after the war. And that kind of gets into your question about the election. When he first ran for the presidency in 2019, Zelensky promised he would only serve one term. The events that are going on now are probably about the best excuse anyone could ever have for breaking a promise like that. And I would be very surprised if in the middle of the war, if it was still going on and there's still no resolution imminent, to see a change in leadership. But I don't know what they do in terms of an election. I mean, they might hold it just to be defiant of the Russians, and just to show that we can do this, even though we're divided. And probably there would be some opposition, but probably Zelensky would win in a landslide in that particular case. But it could also be postponed just because they might think this isn't what they should be focused on logistically. So it's just too hard to predict. And I think too many things depend on what happens in the war. I mean, if there is a quick Ukrainian victory that happens through some channel, like Kremlin power collapsing or something like that, then maybe there'd be calls for elections and a mandate for whoever should succeed Zelensky. As is well known, right? Churchill, after leading Britain to World War II victory, right? He lost his first election after that, right? As people thought that he wasn't the best person for post-war rebuilding, and it's possible that people might come to think that way about Zelensky. We just don't know at this point. So maybe I'll leave it there, but happy to follow up.
Thanks. We've lots of questions coming in the chat already, some hands up, but let me ask one question and then we'll turn to others. You've written and you talked today about civic national identity in Ukraine. And I was wondering if you talk a little bit more about sort of the evidence that you have that there is this civic national identity as opposed to an ethnic national identity. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about what the prospects are for a civic national identity when the war comes to an end. And in particular, to the extent that the war has developed an anti-Russian sort of element as critical to Ukrainian civic national identity, what is that going to do to relations with ethnic Russians within Ukraine? Will there be sort of problems there? I'm just curious about some of, I know you guys have done research on this, just sharing some of your evidence on this, and then your thoughts about the future a little bit.
Oh, and could I just add on to that? One thing is that I think we mentioned maybe even last week that Zelensky's first New Year's Eve address before the war began really emphasized how Ukrainian identity could be open to people of multiple linguistic, cultural backgrounds. And he spoke in at least 4 different languages in that New Year's Eve address, including Russian. Right, so it was like Ukrainian, English, Tatar, but a big chunk of it was in Russian too, and all these different people saying in different languages, "I am Ukrainian." And we've had speakers on, including one student of mine who lives, originally from Kherson, who talk now about how they see sort of a sense of Ukrainianness just being kind of almost reduced, but also solidified and intensified. By its focus on just being anti-Russia and much more kind of hatred driven or oppositionally driven than this kind of diversity and inclusiveness and tolerance that Zelensky initially tried to stand for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, really interesting questions, and I'll try to do them justice in a relatively brief.
Yeah.
I should have maybe prepared some slides, but in the book we have a lot of presentations of different statistics and particularly of surveys, and we also cite a number of studies that indicate the strength of Ukrainian civic identity. So, just for example, while you can find that a good number of people support ethnically exclusivist, if you could put it that way, legislation kind of before, this is all before the war, even before 2019. So, I did with Volodomyr Kulik, my colleague, a survey, and we looked, compared to past surveys on radical reforms in Ukraine. And, we'd find support for, promoting the Ukrainian language, for example, throughout Ukraine, but support for actually making it like the sole mandatory language, was generally not there, right? Like there wasn't a majority of support for, ruling out Russian, for example. But there are a lot of other little interesting things that point in the same direction. So there've been several studies of, what people mean when they say that, they are Ukrainian by nationality. And one of the findings that Vladimir Kulik and others have reached is that it comes to reflect far less like whose parents people think they are, right? Like nationality is no longer, of course, what's in your Soviet passport. You don't have that anymore. And it's not even about what nationality your parents were, but it's increasingly about just your being in Ukraine, and that this meaning of nationality has taken on much less ethnic meaning for people, but it's much more about being civically attached to it. And interestingly enough, for example, is just the idea that these categories that we think of as representing kind of ethnicity actually in the Ukrainian context come to mean something else and have more civic meaning. So if you ask people in Ukraine what your native language is, you'll have large number of people say my native language is Ukrainian, even before the war. But then you'll ask them, what language do you mainly speak, or what language did you grow up with? And a lot of those same people will say Russian. So what they're coming to identify with is Ukrainian language as the language of the state, rather than just the actual language that they speak. And so I think so there's an attachment to the state overall of Ukraine, right? The borders, the citizenship that, we find to be primary in these studies. But then there's also, and this is getting to the question about what the war is changing, association, of course, with the state, with a particular language. But most people in Ukraine reject the idea of having some kind of criteria for being Ukrainian, that you have to speak Ukrainian in order to be Ukrainian. But at the same time, one thing that it's already, you could point to different points in time where this trend accelerated, but in 2014 was one big moment, but of course 2022 another big one. There's an increasing movement to say, okay, well, we're not, like, the Ukrainian state is a state for everyone who considers themselves Ukrainian, but as good Ukrainians, the state should promote the Ukrainian language, and people should learn Ukrainian, and increasingly do so. And you see a lot of people increasingly taking that upon themselves. So, there's one famous Ukrainian author, Vladimir Rafayenko. He's the author, actually, they just translated his most recent novel, I think his most recent one, Mondegreen, at Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute Press. And he himself is from Donbass, grew up speaking Russian, didn't speak Ukrainian well, but then after 2014, declared that, okay, well, I don't want to be the basis upon which Putin makes claims on Ukraine. And so I'm going to shift to speaking Ukrainian, even though I don't speak it very well because I'm Russian. And so Mondegreen is actually, according to him, his first Ukrainian language novel, something that he was a novelist and always wrote in Russian, but now he started to write in Ukrainian. And he says, even though maybe it's not technically as good because he's less gifted at Ukrainian, but he's learning, this is his personal statement. And you can find lots of this sort of happening, especially after 2022, in online spaces where, it's a combination of things. I think it's a combination both of a lot of just very sincere feelings by people wanting to switch, but there's also a lot of social pressures now to switch because, people start to question other people's loyalties if, you continue to speak Russian. So there are a lot of people then that just choose to speak Ukrainian to avoid those questions. At the same time, again, it's still complicated because Russian-speaking Ukrainians, those who kind of grew up speaking Russian and a lot of whom still speak Russian, are among the fiercest fighters against Russia today. And so, I do think it's going to be hard to tell those people in the end that, you're not really a good Ukrainian.
Right.
But I think that in the end, that's, what Ukraine is still going to be about, is this more civic identity. But I agree, there's going to be pressures there, and that's going to be something that is going to have to be resolved, by the Ukrainian government and its politicians, and probably there'll be political competition over that. Is sort of, what will be the kind of cultural content of the state, and are there going to be ethnic criteria for belonging, at least on an official level, or not? And kind of what Zelensky, I think, has always represented has been this more inclusive version that really de-emphasizes the importance of language, among other things. I mean, not that he doesn't value it, right? I mean, he speaks it and does so now, but he thinks politics should be about other things. But the war, mixes up a lot of this, especially because the justification, the rationale for the war in Putin's eyes has been precisely that this is Russia, and these people that are expressing Russianness in these different ways are really part of us, Russians, and so therefore we need to do that. So I think it's going to be a difficult time, sorting out these issues about exactly how to draw the line, recognizing Russian-speaking Ukrainians' own roles in resisting Russia versus the need to flesh out and support other aspects of Ukrainianness, Ukrainian cultural identity, its language, culture, through state mechanisms. But like I said, a lot of Russian-speaking Ukrainians are kind of moving in this direction already. So my guess is that, my best guess probably is that this is a question that's maybe going to resolve itself without having the state itself having to adopt, policies that might be, might raise questions in terms of, human rights or, respect for languages. But, again, that's something to be seen.
This is all fantastic. Wow, we could go on for hours. It's clear. Let's turn to a couple of questions from the audience, and we'll start with Christopher. You have your hand up. Go ahead and turn on your mic and ask your question.
Okay. Hi. Yes, thank you for taking my question. Professor Hale, I must say I'm enjoying reading your book very much, and I started reading it on Tuesday. I'm still not through with chapter 3 yet, but what struck me most about it is how normal Ukraine really is. I mean, it's the second largest country in Europe, and yet when I read passages like this one, when watching Servants of the People, it is impossible to avoid the sense that Ukraine is a society and a culture based on frustration. They, the politicians, always lie, cheat, and steal, and we, the people, do everything we can just to get by. By that also involves implicitly buying into the system, paying bribes, and trying to use what contacts one has to get ahead. When you think about the machinations, some not very legal, in this country of parents trying to get their children into Ivy League schools, this seems very, very American. And in fact, I was wondering when you were writing this book, if you ever thought of, did you ever feel that you're actually maybe writing about how this is applicable to the United States?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the answer is yes. My thinking on this goes back. My biggest kind of statement where I've talked about these, my perspective on this form of politics is in my book, which came out in 2014 or 2015, depending on which publication. I call it Patronal Politics, and I talk about this as a politics working through connections without a rule of law, as being a way that is a form of politics that is in fact very common throughout the world. And it's more a matter of degree than anything like that. Kind of how much it matters and the extent that it matters for people's lives. And most countries in the post-Soviet space, including Ukraine, kind of fall in this category where this patronal politics element, where you kind of have to, you just accept the reality of different forms of corruption because this is the way things are. And even though I'm personally opposed, you kind of have to work with it. Otherwise, maybe you're not even going to make it. And you even get situations where politicians will be rebuked by voters for not taking advantage of the connections they have to help their own constituents, right? To get something located in their region, right? If you didn't pay off the right people, you're not doing your job, right? But to kind of bring resources to your own community. And so, it gets into sort of some complex ethical area. And so I have thought my book, Patronal Politics, is more about the post-Soviet region. But just to your point, I've been thinking over these last years, actually since that book, about writing something that extends more globally and does focus on practices like this in the West. And in that case, you write it normalizes Ukraine even more.
And may I just say one thing more? Crimea. In 2014, when Putin invaded Crimea, didn't that pretty much prevent Ukraine even from being considered for the EU, inclusion in the EU and also in NATO? Because apparently there are rules pertaining to both those organizations that a country with existing territorial disputes are not allowed to become members.
Well, it would complicate that, certainly. But I think in general, there are ways of dealing with that question, in the sense that, exceptions have been made for countries joining the EU. Bulgaria, Romania maybe didn't quite meet all the formal criteria to the extent that they should have. And so, maybe that there could be ways to put that off. And there's certainly countries in the EU that have outstanding territorial disputes, Greece, for example. And so I think that there would have been ways. I don't think it would have been like the end to it. I don't think Ukraine would have had to have given up that in order to have EU aspirations, had the EU decided to do it. But I do think that maybe, there are some in the European Union that maybe started to think that, well, okay, there's too many problems associated with Ukraine, let's just not think about it. And, my sense is that was a mistake.
There are so many questions.
Yeah.
There are so many questions in the chat that I'm going to take one from there, and then Gail, you'll be next after that. But Batu in the chat is asking, will Belarus potentially have some kind of democratic awakening similar to that which Ukraine has experienced under Zelensky? And I know that's a hypothetical question, and you're not a Belarusia expert, but you are a civil society expert. And it is interesting that several years ago, Belarusia had these amazing protests organized largely by women, but they somehow failed to, generate significant regime change. I mean, so can you comment something about what allows civil society to sort of succeed in affecting change, or at least creating a moment of possibility in one country, but not in another, both in the Soviet sphere of influence, like Ukraine and Belarus?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another great question. I mean, my sense is that the populations tend to mobilize and be able to mobilize at moments when there is some opportunity to do so, or some catalyst. Because when you have an authoritarian regime like you have in Belarus or in Russia, there's a very strong repressive apparatus. And so everyone thinking individually about, well, is it really worth my while to go out in the street and join those kind of hardcore activists in fighting the regime or not, right? Even if I'm opposed to the regime. And large numbers of people, when the repressive apparatus is strong, are likely to say, well, maybe not, right? I don't want to risk my life. I don't think it's going to succeed. But that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you have all these people that think it's going to be a failure and therefore don't turn out, right, it becomes a failure. And so the key is like, at what moment does the perception of the possible change? And a lot of my kind of comparative research on different post-Soviet countries and others with similar political systems finds that, not surprisingly, moments of succession can be very important moments when expectations change, because once the people start to think that the leader might be on the way out, all the people around the leader, right, classic succession politics, have to start thinking about a future without that leader. And they want to start protecting their interests for that future. Maybe they even want to become the next leader. And so all of this then decenters the leader and starts to unravel the political system, all these powerful political economic networks that I was talking about earlier, which have vast reach throughout society through all these personal connections and people owing them favors and their control over resources, right? They can do a lot of things that can cause ferment and create space for, or even directly mobilize, kind of call members of the public out to action, right? If they think it will serve their purpose by weakening a rival political network or clan. And so one of the patterns that I've noticed is that, almost all of the revolutions where you've seen a popular uprising that has toppled a leadership in the post-Soviet space have occurred when there is a moment of succession, usually when the leader has already announced that they are on the way out, or, and are trying to usher in a successor. So that's what happened at the Orange Revolution. Kuchma was not, had announced he was not running for re-election in 2004, the presidential elections, and instead was trying to get his chosen successor, Viktor Yanukovych, elected. But that kind of unraveled things in all kinds of ways. And you could point the Rose Revolution similarly in Georgia. Shevardnadze, the incumbent president, had announced he was no longer going to run. And, this created a lot of space. And one thing about Belarus is that in the early 1990s, they got a young leader who was also quite popular. And he's been around for a while now. But I think what's changing in Belarus is, partly society's changing, right? It's becoming more, modern and developed. But the leader is aging, right? He's getting older, and questions increasingly start to arise at that point about what the future will bring. And that means that all the people around him, including people from slightly further removed, start to think about what comes next. And so I do think that when you're in territory like the leader of Belarus is now, some kind of spark, could potentially lead to some type of unexpected revolution. And, often these happen around elections, and we saw something that seemed to come pretty close last time. And my guess is this is a kind of pressure that's only going to be building as he ages, and that his picking of a successor is not going to solve that problem. And I actually think this is also something that may be facing Putin increasingly as well, as another more or less leader who's squeezing out alternatives, whose departure is going to leave a lot of uncertainty for a lot of people who have a lot at stake, and therefore, they're not going to want to go down with the captain there.
Yeah, Euromaidan's an interesting sort of exception to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But let's turn to Gail. You've been waiting patiently.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Hale. I'm wondering if with all of your surveys, you can address something that I've been wondering about throughout all of this. I haven't really got any answers, which is the attitude of the people in those regions that are sort of semi-independent towards Ukraine, towards the war. I don't know how much war activity there is there.
So like the occupied regions of the Donbass, like the eastern Ukraine.
The far eastern ones that are sort of semi-independent.
Yeah, I mean, I have not personally done kind of polling work there. So all I can do is kind of think back to, the surveys that I've seen done by others. And I think one thing that one finds in those areas is that it's especially hard to know what you're dealing with in terms of real public opinion there, because it's a lot more, it's a smaller place, and survey work is a lot less familiar. At the same time, I think one of the things that one does see is that Russian propaganda, is effective. And so, it has an effect on the local population to the extent that they believe things like that the Kiev government is run by Nazis, even though its president is Jewish, right? But they come to believe these things. I mean, there was one interesting study which tried to get at this by looking at regions of eastern Ukraine that were in range of Russian television channels broadcasting signals, right? The on the ground signals, not that. So even though Ukraine has banned Russian channels, there's still some people in eastern Ukraine who were in range of the broadcast towers broadcasting Russian television. And some people were and some people were not, because maybe they're in certain valleys or geographic formations that made their reception bad, right? And so that's an interesting way, because you're looking at people that are almost all the same, right, living in the same area, but there is some variation in who's going to get the Russian signal and who doesn't. And so this research team did a survey of those people along that area, and they found that just by looking at where people lived and whether it was in range of the Russian signal, and that was really the only thing differentiating them from others, made a difference in their views and made people more sympathetic to the Russian position. And so it's hard to say what the real attitudes of the people in these occupied regions of the Donbass is right now. Plus, like a lot of the people that were anti-Russian have fled, and new people have come in. So it's I do think it's a very difficult situation. I mean, what you see in the opinion polls is a number of people supporting independence there. But if you actually had a more free environment, I mean, I haven't seen people use the techniques that I would want to use, for example, to kind of get at what people really think, because there are ways of kind of doing that, that you can kind of get at what people really think without making them say so publicly. And that's what I really haven't seen there.
So on the subject of public opinion, then let me kind of pull off of a question that Jeffrey Milstein put in the chat too. So when you started, you were talking about Russian public opinion and its relation to sort of the beginning of the war. And I'm just wondering, sort of, what do we know now about what the Russian public thinks about the war? Do they support the war? Do they oppose the war? Will it make a difference if we're talking about Crimea versus Eastern Ukraine, which you seem to indicate that there was a difference of opinion there? I'm just wondering, sort of, what's the state of what we know about Russian public opinion at this moment?
Yeah, big question. And I think there's still a question mark there.
Of course.
Right. I think it's complicated because first, we have to think about. First of all, polls show, right, the polls that are conducted, right, including by independent agencies like Levada Center, still is able to conduct opinion polls, right? They show people support the war. But on the other hand, I mean, legally, they can't ask them about specifically what's going on, right? So they can't even call it a war in their polls. And that raised the question of what people think that is actually going on, right? And so what they're told by Russian propaganda is that, in fact, this is a special military operation. I mean, I think Putin, like, one time, like, almost, like very recently only called it a war, referred to it as a war. But, what the way they've been sold this is that, well, this is a special military operation. It's limited in scope. It's not directed at exterminating Ukrainians. Instead, what it is about protecting people from the aggressors in Kiev, protecting the people in the eastern regions, that this is all part of a Western plot to weaken Russia, and if Russia hadn't undertaken this military action, the West was all ready to move in and start aggressively taking more territory and ultimately undermining and isolating Russia. So there is the open question about what Russians understand when they're given questions like, do you support the military operation? And my presumption is, without seeing evidence on this, is that some probably understand, but some don't. I mean, there are a lot of people that are apolitical, don't really pay attention to politics. And then you factor in just other things that complicate any kind of rallying around the flag phenomenon. For one hand, I mean, there's tremendous social pressures that people feel to say that they support something when they don't in Russia. And there has been a little bit of research in Russia that's shown that there's, at least 15% of the Russian public, in fact, doesn't support the war that say they do in opinion polls. So there's some documented dissembling that people are doing. But then, it gets complicated, right? So some people kind of lie to pollsters, whereas others think, well, okay, I don't support what the Russian army is doing, but they're Russians, they're our sons and daughters, so I support the troops, right? Or, I don't think we should have done it, but now that we did it, we're in, right? I have to support it. There are a lot of people that just don't want to face up to the reality, that probably know at some level what's going on, but don't want to maybe even admit it to themselves. And they don't look for the truth, even though maybe they could find it. And then there are others that are just simply afraid, right? They're afraid that maybe a poll, their answer to a poll that's, to a question that might be even illegal for them to express, right? Opposition to the war, that they may not be able to, they feel they can't express their real opinion. So I think that a lot of this is going on all at once. And I think that what we can say, obviously, is that a majority of Russians don't feel strongly enough against it to risk their lives to do kind of what Ukrainians are forced to do, and risk their lives to oppose what's going on for the sake of Ukrainians. But like the reasons why they don't do that get very complicated. My own sense is that this is not a popular war. I think there is a significant share of people that support it, right? So I don't want to say that there's not a core of support for it, right? I think it's probably pretty large, but probably not a majority. But that lots of other people kind of go along or are hiding their views for one of these, other reasons. But again, not taking it upon themselves to oppose it in the active form that I think, Ukrainians would certainly say they should be morally
right. I think there's definitely like a ton of people who are sort of passive or, hoping to kind of even shut it out as much as they can. But obviously we've run a little bit over time. We're going to keep going until I think 2:15 if our guest is willing. But I just wanted to bring like sort of three things that I've noticed in questions on the chat for you maybe just to like fleetingly comment on, Henry. But you've just talked about Russian popular opinion. I noticed your book is reviewed in the New York Review of Books, and Timothy Garton Ash, like in talking about Ukrainian popular opinion, cites a poll where he reports that 68% of Ukrainians in 2022 reported feeling happy. I mean, this is despite, the hardship, suffering, death that's going on all around them. And that's dramatically up from like the 53% that reported feeling happy in 2017. So, I mean, again, Ash is citing this as reflective of like the high amount of social unity that you see in Ukraine. But one of the questions in the chat that I thought was kind of interesting, and I know it's a hypothetical, so it's hard to really, answer, but George did ask, what do you think would have happened if Poroshenko had been president when Putin invaded? And so I guess I'm just wondering, given the outpouring of national support in Ukraine for this war in defense of the homeland, could you imagine a hypothetical where Putin just would have been able to sweep in? And then a second, like sort of element of questioning that I'm seeing, one that was articulated by Zach, who is from Kiev. He asked specifically, should Ukraine have kept its nuclear weapons? And I guess that ties to like sort of a bigger strand of questioning, like, were there mistakes in the past that were made where this like war could have been avoided? I mean, Joel is asking like if Putin had received assurances that Ukraine would never join NATO, would the conflict have been avoided? Those kinds of things. Do you see any kind of big moment where we should have done something, or Ukraine should have done something, or that could have prevented this from happening? And then the third one, and I realize these are all like big and massive and totally unfair to ask you in like 2 minutes, but in regard to what you were saying about Belarus as well as Ukraine, and people have been talking about Moldova in the chat as well, like What do you see as the impact of the war on Belarus and Moldova now? I mean, of course, everybody wants to know, what does the future hold for Ukraine? But like, how have these states changed already as a result of this war? In 90 seconds or less. I'm joking about that. I'm joking about that. But you see, I mean, we're all friends here. Sorry.
I mean, yeah, the first two are counterfactuals, and so they're a little hard, to answer. I just think a Poroshenko presidency probably, had he won that election, it would have been different. But I think Ukrainians would have rallied around him, strongly, much like they rallied around Zelensky. And that, that gets back to, I think, our book's overarching argument, which is the Ukrainian resistance is, more about the nation than it is about the individual leader. I do think, there'd be some nuances. I think Zelensky was particularly well positioned to discredit the Russian narrative, maybe abroad, because he is of Jewish heritage. He is a native Russian speaker, and so Poroshenko is more the type of person that you would have expected to stay in their place and fight. Whereas like Zelensky is someone who Russia's own narrative would not have expected that, right? And didn't expect.
So interesting.
Right. And so I think that, maybe there would have been some effect there, but I think the nation would have responded in pretty much the same way, rallied around the leader, just be different people kind of waiting for the future to, express their differences in a democratic fashion after victory, right? So then the second question about historical junctures, right? Possible junctures. I mean, yeah, hindsight is 2020. What I remember from the 1994 discussions, and again, I'm not a nuclear expert, I'm not a military security person, but what I remember hearing from people as those debates were ongoing was that people in the know was that, well, in fact, the nuclear materials that Ukraine had, it was not actually in position to go nuclear in any kind of concrete way with what it had, and so that effectively it wasn't seeding anything concrete that could have been used to mobilize a nuclear deterrent. In retrospect, right, over the course of 30 years, maybe it could have developed that technology. But then again, who knows? So maybe it was a big mistake to do that, right? Especially maybe the mistake was not getting hard enough security guarantees, from the Western countries for that step. The counter argument would be that, well, had Ukraine done that, it would have been rejected. There was under international pressure, non-proliferation pressure. Maybe it would have provoked a stronger reaction in Russia earlier than it did. But hindsight is 2020. Right. Probably if we're nuclear, it'd be much. I don't think Russia would have been as quick to do what it did. So I think at any one of these points, I mean, I think maybe what I see as a bigger possible juncture would have been like for the European Union, as you alluded to too, not to make more of an effort to accept Ukraine, because unlike NATO, there's long been support in Ukraine for integration with the European Union. And I think that could have been a mechanism that would have promoted faster reform in Ukraine, given it more hope in that sense. And that would have catalyzed a whole chain reaction of things that might have been more positive. All this at a time when Russia initially didn't see the European Union in particular as the biggest threat. It was more concerned about NATO. But I think had Ukraine been embraced by the European Union earlier, maybe that would have been a path to kind of bringing it in and securing it for the long run earlier. And then the final question, I'm sorry, just one word reminder, the topic.
Belarus, Moldova, and the effect.
Belarus, Moldova. Yeah, I mean, I have not done personal research in these countries or been involved with surveys, like done surveys myself in these countries. But my understanding from people who have been doing this work is, or who are kind of on the ground, is that the public, even in Belarus, is opposed to the war. They don't want to be involved. They think it was a big error. And so I do think that this may be, again, getting back to the earlier question on Belarus, also crystallizing some opposition to Lukashenko, the president, who is, so in tight cahoots with Putin. You know, and Lukashenko's always tried to kind of wiggle back and forth. He kind of, you know, he's very much in line with Putin and casts himself as an ally, but he flirts with the West at times too to try to get concessions from Putin. That game becomes very hard to play now, especially. And so if something turns wrong, you know, that like if you get something happening in Russia where Russian power implodes, maybe you could see a lot of things happening in Belarus. And, you know, Moldova as well. My sense is this significantly improves Moldova's European aspirations. You know, at the same time, it's a complicated political system. You have a lot of Russian levers that they can pull in different parts of Moldova, and you have the separatist occupied Transnistria region as well, which is kind of a lever that Russia holds.
And I had been focused on work this morning. I didn't see the news that the Moldovan prime minister resigned today.
Yeah.
So there's something really interesting perhaps going to be going on there in the coming days.
No, I hadn't seen that either.
It was only what people were writing in the chat that let me know that this had happened.
Yeah.
So yeah, things can continue to change quickly.
I mean, if there's time just for one more thought,
please.
I mean, on retaking Transnistria, I mean, I think, you know, that if something happens in Russia, I think that's a possibility. But the challenge then for the rest of Moldova is that you know, the political views in Transnistria and the political forces that you know, have roots there are not in line with you know, the political forces that you know, have dominated in the rest of Moldova. So basically, you'd be, you know, it's kind of like one set of politicians would be bringing into the country a huge population of opposition politicians, and so it's, you know, I think it would be complicated. I mean, maybe there would be some moment of unity because you have the financial industrial groups in Transnistria actually pretty integrated into the Moldovan economy, and even going through Moldova to export to Europe. So maybe there could find some kind of accommodation there through that. But I think, you know, it enhances the opportunities for Moldova to join Europe, but potentially raises a lot of complicated issues that they're going to have to solve.
So there were so many questions still. And we are, I think, just out of time, unfortunately, for today. Cynthia, can you just tell us a little bit about what we got coming next week?
Yes, absolutely. And please, next week will be the one time that we ask you to accommodate a change of time. It'll be an hour later because our guest will be with us from Israel. His name is Brandon Friedman. He's the head of a Middle East Research Center at Tel Aviv University, and he's an expert on Iran in particular. He's going to be talking a little bit about the changing role of Iran in the Middle East, but also Iran's relationship to Russia. He's also done a fair amount of research and writing on the global oil industry and the role that like certain Middle Eastern countries are playing now in helping wash Russian oil into the global market and help get around sanctions a bit. So, and he also, of course, is just interested in, you know, Israel's role in the Middle East as well. So he's a wonderful, charismatic speaker. Maybe, you know, we had a glorious one. Henry sets a very high bar, but Brendan is fantastic too. So please tune in next week at 2:00 for our speaker who will be with us from Israel.
And we want to thank Henry Hale for joining us today. Henry, you were just absolutely fantastic.
Amazing.
We just so appreciate having you here and you know, taking everything we can from you, asking you these huge questions that are completely unfair, but you gave us, I think, really thoughtful answers. So
and thank you to the audience too.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Steve, didn't mean to interrupt, but like also the engagement in the chat, we can't thank you enough. I'm going to save it and go over it. And that's exactly what we want to see, is that kind of participation and collegiality. So thank you so much to all of you for tuning in.
And don't forget to get a hold of Yevgeny Zamyatin's novel, We, that we're going to talk about together on the 3rd of March. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Bye.